Hello and welcome, dear listener. Episode 450 of the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove podcast. I'm Trevor, aka the Iron Fist. With me at the moment is Joe, the tech guy. How are you, Joe?
I'm good. Evening all.
We think Scott's going to be joining us, but he hasn't appeared yet. But he'll hopefully pop his head in and join us for this podcast. 450, heading towards that magic 500. I know I'll get to 500. I don't know if I'll get to 501, but probably. Can't help myself. Joe, we've seen more of each other, it seems, in the last week than we normally do because we had the late podcast on Wednesday, which was because I had a knee operation, dear listener, on the Monday. I foolishly thought that I could undergo a arthroscopic surgery in the afternoon and I'd be fine to podcast that night. Turned out not the case. That's why they got delayed till Wednesday. And then we caught up on Sunday with Scott over a few beers, which was very good, a few other people, which was good. And now we're back on Monday night. So, Joe, I've seen you 3 times in 5 days.
Yeah.
Haven't got bored of you yet.
Only once in person, though. It was actually nice to see each other in person.
It was.
Normally it's over the camera.
Yeah, it was. Well, at one point there with Scott and various other people, it was almost like an episode of the podcast as we started arguing over different things. Yeah, so that was good. I'm getting hot. I'm going to just put this air conditioning on.
Okay.
Right. What are we going to talk about, dear listener? So if you're in the chat room, say hello. And topics. Just a little bit from some of the conversations we had on Sunday that we'll talk about, how different people voted, which surprised me. I finished a biography on Vladimir Putin. Talk about that. Another topic that came up was about whether there are North Korean soldiers on the Russian side fighting in the Ukraine. Talk about that. US election, of course. Let's talk about democracy. What is it? Is it just if you're putting a ballot into a ballot box, I'm saying that's not democracy. There's a lot more to it than that. And a lot of our so-called democracies really aren't. Joe found some interesting stuff about donations. Hex debt is in the news. Guy Rundle's sacked. BRICS, a bunch of other things. Dastardly Chinese have been selling cheap cars. Good heavens. And so that's all on the agenda. Sounds like Scott's about to join us. We'll bring him in. And
G'day.
Scott, how are you?
Not too bad. And yourself?
Very well. I've done the introduction. And
Sorry I'm a little late.
Yeah, that's fine. So it was good to see you, Scott, in person on Sunday.
Yes, it was a lot of fun, wasn't it?
Yes, I was saying to Joe, it was a bit like almost an episode of the podcast as we were arguing about the things.
It got a little bit heated, but it wasn't too bad.
Yeah, it wasn't too bad. I felt myself a bit outnumbered. I don't know. I started to
because
defend,
you've got an idiotic decision to make, you know.
as I started to defend Vladimir Putin, I suddenly found myself surrounded by people who wanted to disagree with me.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
I would like to read that book, though, once you've finished it.
Yeah. So the book is... Let's talk about that.
A Man for All Seasons.
His Life and Times, Putin, by Philip Short. And Philip Short has written biographies about Mao and about Mitterrand and Pol Pot. So spent 8 years...
Dictators.
Yeah. Just does biographies on bad guys.
Yes.
And he spent 8 years researching it, and it's heavily referenced. And I think it seems to me a fairly fair and honest account, not a biased one. Like he tells it when it's bad, and he tells it when perhaps it's okay. And so interesting. Highly recommend it. I guess the thing that comes out of it for me as I'm reading it, well, I finished reading it after speaking to you guys. The Putin, you know how he sort of had to step down from the presidency and Medvedev took over and they sort of
Yes.
swapped and he went back to prime minister and then later came back as president. Up until that point, I think his behaviour deteriorated after that. When he came back in the second stint, a number of the things that he did were a lot worse than the stuff he did before then. But I guess what you've got to consider is that he becomes president in a Russia that has very little experience with democracy and very little experience with capitalism. And people just have to lower their expectations of what can be done when a society is just not at all adapted to changing over to those things. It takes time. You can't do it overnight. And things like corruption, for example, where you've got a country that's been functioning on corruption for 100 years, if you were just to come in and just say, right, all that corruption stuff is over and done with, it's a system and a culture that's been based on that for so long that you just couldn't do it. People wouldn't know how to do it for starters, and you'd also get killed. Like you could have all the good intentions of the world, but you can't change everything in a culture overnight or indeed in a decade. Some of this stuff takes time. And so the picture that was painted was of a guy who, okay, like everybody, took different bribes and things, but it really wasn't, he was by no means one of the worst offenders. His record was pretty good, and that was quoting some CIA people who were saying that. So the image that comes across, particularly in his first period, is genuinely of a patriot who is there because he's got ideas about what he thinks is best for Russia, and it's not so much about acquiring wealth or riches for himself, but
I mean, I'd heard he was a puppet for the real powers that be, and they thought he was a pliable puppet and they put him in power. And it was later on that they discovered actually he wasn't quite as pliable as they thought he was. Because he'd been a minor functionary in the St. Petersburg mayor office, wasn't he?
Yes.
Yeah, he was.
Yes.
And effectively doing deals for the Russian mafia.
Yes.
In the mayor's office. And
Yes.
they thought, well, if we stick him in as president, he'll carry on doing deals on our behalf.
But in order to get foreign investment and foreigners into St. Petersburg, then you had to deal with the mafia. Like that was, you just couldn't operate without them. So, because they already owned stuff, like a lot of the sell-off of public assets had
that was
had
woeful.
occurred under Yeltsin. So a lot of that kleptocracy had occurred, and he, according to this book, was basically saying to the kleptocrats, okay, what you've got now, you can keep, but we're not doing any more cheap sell-offs of public infrastructure like you've been enjoying. So
Apparently Yeltsin approached Clinton, I think it was, and said, give us $1 billion to roll out democracy, to migrate. And Clinton went, why would I pay you money? It's going to happen anyway.
yeah.
And I think a properly funded transition would probably not have been quite so corrupt. I'm not going to say it wouldn't have been corrupt, but I think there would have been, because, the average Russian back in the 90s was starving because the social safety net had just been pulled out from under them.
Yeah. So they're relying on these kickbacks to support their families and lifestyle and whatever. So
I wouldn't even say lifestyle, their life.
yes. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know that any amount of money could have just transformed the psyche of the Russian people quickly. That's one of the problems, I think, is just recognizing an existing culture and that he had to work within that. So Then, of course, after he came back for his second stint as president, he seemed to then latch onto religion and culture stuff and started to attack his enemies even more and getting more sort of paranoid, and it's a darker picture painted at that point. So, mixed bag, but...
what about Navalny then?
Yeah, so he was...
was he an enemy of Putin or not?
He was underestimated at first, and they let him run in an election, and he got more than they thought he would get. So Navalny and a bunch of political opponents, particularly in his second term, because in his first term he was very popular, so he didn't really have threats from these guys. They were only ever going to get 5 or 10% or something. So he had such a sort of a strong popularity because of the way he'd dealt with things at that point that he wasn't too concerned about the opposition. When he came back the second time, I think the polls were a lot closer, so more corruption and skullduggery required to subdue opposition members. So, yeah.
Yeah. It's one of those things. I know Navalny was no saint, but he certainly appeared to accept democracy more than what Vladimir Putin appears to have accepted it.
Yeah. So anyway, it was a good read, and I thought it was important because the author made the effort to help you empathise and put yourself in the position of where he was and what's potential, what can be done potentially and what's just way too far down the track in terms of expectations. So, yeah. So that was Putin, Biography. Recommend that one if you are interested. What else did I want to say? Just from our discussion, I won't mention names about one of the people who was with us on Sunday, but a very pro-green person in their attitudes to life and activities who preferenced Labor over the Greens because of the Israel-Gaza policies. I was just floored by that, Scott. I just...
I think I know who you're talking about, but once we go off air, I'll actually confirm that. But it's one of those things. I would have thought that anyone that even just looked at the news with one eye open would have actually preferenced the Greens ahead of the Labor Party if they were really voting on Palestinian issues.
Yeah. So,
Well, no, he was voting against Palestine. He wanted Israel to have the right to defend itself.
He was pro-Israel, anti-Palestine.
Oh, was he?
Yes.
Okay. Goodness me.
Yeah. So, and a very greeny person who then put the Greens lower than Labor because of the position of the Greens on Israel and Gaza in a state election where really, foreign affairs isn't a state election matter. But anyway, that just that one surprised me. So, but as part of that, we were having a discussion, and he said that the Palestinians in Israel can vote, and I said they can't, and it turns out they can if they're in Israel proper, not part of the
provided they've got
occupied territory, and provided they are a citizen.
Yeah.
And
so that's the whole point. If they can get citizenship, they can have an Israeli ID card, which means they can vote.
Yes. But, in order to do that, you've got lots of people just don't do it because there's a Hebrew language requirement, and you've got to acknowledge Israel's control of Jerusalem. So there's a few things that are just going to be unpalatable to most Palestinians as a precondition to becoming a citizen. And then, of course, you're just a minority, and the Israeli government is not going to be making any laws that are favourable to you, and lots of the villages and enclaves where the Palestinians live get a lot less money than the Jewish areas, and there is a lot of direct discrimination against them, even when they are citizens with voting rights. So, but it was true that they do get voting rights, a small proportion who are citizens. So don't want to mislead anybody who was there on that one. What else have we got? Oh, Scott, and the other one that came up in that topic was that you mentioned, I think, about North Koreans fighting for the Russians against the Ukraine. And
well, they haven't actually been deployed to Ukraine yet. My understanding is they're just in the Kursk region. Now, whether or not they're being trained up for it or what have you, I don't know.
Right.
But it does seem bizarre that a country like North Korea that's paranoid about its southern border would actually allow 10,000 of its troops to move that far north.
And I said to you, how do you know that's the case?
Say again?
I said to you, how do you know that's the case? And you were like, I've just read it somewhere or something.
Yeah, I read it somewhere.
Yeah. So there was an article in the John Menadue blog, and it's a reproduction of a piece from Moon Over Alabama. You guys ever read that blog?
No.
Wasn't he one of the ones who was getting money from RT?
Don't know. Could have been. But interesting article, which was in the John Menadue blog, reproducing Moon of Alabama. And he makes the point. Well, first of all, Scott, there is no evidence of any North Koreans anywhere near the border. So who has said that? I'll get to it. But he was sort of saying in this blog piece that that this was a propaganda campaign claiming that thousands of North Korean soldiers will soon fight on the Russian side. And he said that it would make little sense that the incursion at Kursk, for one, is already mostly defeated, and that the language and cultural problems would make the integration of such forces into Russian military operations nearly impossible. And he was sure that the Russian military would be strongly against it. That would make sense to me. There would be huge language difficulties with these groups. And he was claiming that the whole thing was fake news. And then he read what did he read? He didn't know that the idea for the campaign, or for this propaganda campaign, he reckons comes from RAND, R-A-N-D, the Pentagon's think tank. So it's been the Ukraine that's claiming that the North Koreans are there. 3 days before the start of Zelensky's campaign, a RAND analyst wrote, "What should the United States do? Given the differences in the objectives of Russia, China and North Korea, the United States should be mounting major information operations against these three countries to highlight their differences and fuel distrust amongst them." And so the RAND Corporation 3 days beforehand is saying, we should do a misinformation campaign. And one of the suggestions was that the South Korean defence minister has said that North Korea will likely send more of its troops to support Russia. Given Russian attitudes, those troops might well serve as cannon fodder. The North Korean elites need to hear what Kim may do to their sons. So the RAND Corporation published a suggested piece of misinformation that the South Koreans could do. And then, of course, 3 days later, the Ukrainian army, headed by General Budanov, started to leak claims that there were North Korean troops in Russia. Budanov was one of the members of Ukrainian's intelligence directorate, trained by the CIA. And initially it was 1,500 North Koreans. Then there were 3,000. The latest is claiming 11,000 North Koreans. And South Korean news agency repeated the claim. And the New York Times jumped in and also repeated the claim. And there's an entire New York Times article which I read based on the premise that North Korean troops are fighting in Ukraine. And it goes on talking about how they're getting value. You know, they're there because they're going to get valuable fighting experience. It's not until the 15th paragraph does the reader learn that there is no evidence for this whatsoever. NATO General Secretary Mark Rutte, so NATO General Secretary, said the Allies, quote, have no evidence that North Korean soldiers are involved in the fight. So all we've got is a Ukrainian allegation and a couple of videos floating around Twitter which are dispelled for various reasons. Soldiers have got the wrong uniforms, blah, blah, blah. So at this stage, the best guess would be that this is a misinformation campaign by the Ukrainians claiming North Korean involvement. NATO says there's no evidence, and it's just a bit of a beat-up, Scott, it looks like.
Fair enough.
But this is where things, just a simple claim by the Ukrainians, also by the South Koreans, and you just get news groups who repeat that claim, and you read the headline and the reason why the North Koreans would be there, and you've got to delve deep into the article before you get to the factual point that says, actually, there's no proof that there's any of them there. And most people just won't do it. Like, this is the sort of misinformation and propaganda we get all the fucking time. It's so frustrating. Most people don't have the time for this.
Yeah, I know. Well, I'm one of those that didn't have the time for it.
Yeah. So, look, might turn out next week a whole bunch of North Koreans rock up. But at this point in time, there is no evidence. So
yeah, I mean, Al Jazeera have just reported what everybody is saying, but said we asked an international expert who said it was possible. Just so, no direct evidence, but
yeah. The other thing that when I first heard the news and that sort of stuff, I thought it was a little bit strange that they were talking about. They were alleging that they were moved from North Korea to Vladivostok via ship, which to move 10,000 troops would take a hell of a lot of ships.
Why wouldn't you put them on a train?
Exactly. Now, I don't know.
Just the thought of coordinating a foreign force, different language, different culture, doesn't sound easy to me.
Sort of distance.
Don't forget Russia borders North Korea. They are very, very similar groups. So Russians include people from the Far East who are not that dissimilar from the North Koreans, probably speak a very similar language.
Would there be that many Russian generals at the Ukrainian border who can speak North Korean? And would there be that many North Koreans who could speak Russian?
I don't know.
And can you just throw a foreign force in amongst your boys and say, "Come on, guys, figure it out"?
That's why if you were going to take them over there, you'd have them trained up and everything like that to be their own individual fighting force.
Yeah.
So you'd send them on a particular mission. They'd go in and they'd attack that particular area.
Yeah. John in the chat says, have you ever heard of the Trans-Siberian Railway?
Yeah, I know
but you were
that,
saying
John,
that the report was they went by ship. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what they were saying. The report was they went by ship to Vladivostok, and then they're going to jump on the Trans-Siberian Railway to then move over to the western part of Russia.
The longest rail journey in the world goes through Russia and down into North Korea.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then it would make more sense that they're moving by train then.
Yeah.
You were talking about wanting to go on that, weren't you?
Yeah, me and Brian would like to go on the Trans-Siberian Railway at some point.
So smells like a bullshit story. Let's see what happens.
I did look. There's actually a road that goes all the way across the east. I didn't think there was, but there is. But I was talking to a Russian friend of mine who basically said, back in the good times before all the funds started drying up, there was a story about a group of people traveling across the Trans-Siberian Highway, and the rains came, and they were stuck there for months.
Right.
Because this is dirt road.
Yes.
And when the rains come, it just turns into mud. And they were literally helicoptering out food supplies to them.
Right.
Oh, really?
When the sort of permafrost wasn't permanent.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there we go. John's going to bet me a schooner. Okay. Sounds like...
What's the bet on for?
Right, the bet is, at this present time, there are 10,000 North Korean troops in the Russian-Ukraine
It really wouldn't
border
surprise
region.
me that it really wouldn't.
And
surprise
nobody's
me
got
that,
a good picture of it.
No, it really wouldn't surprise me that Kim Jong-un could have moved 10,000 troops up there. As to why, I'm not exactly certain. It could be just trying to scare the shit out of the Ukrainians. You never know. It could be just that sort of thing. I would doubt that even an idiot like Kim Jong-un would want to actually get involved in a foreign war like that. You know?
John says, okay. That's good, John. I'm looking forward to the schooner, the free schooner. That'll be good. So I'll remember that next time. You're probably remembering when I met John last, I took him to a place which was like a half-price happy hour. It was incredibly cheap drinks, so he knows it's not going to cost much. So,
right.
Yeah, there we go. So, well, it just reminded me of the classic CIA misinformation, which was described by a former CIA agent, John Stockwell, in a video that I've seen a few different times, where he said that like a third of their payroll was on propaganda and journalists, and they would just pay off obscure journalists in third world countries, in obscure newspapers like the Zanzibar Times or something, where they would say, here's a story, e.g., the North Koreans are in Russia, and then they would tell their journalists who worked in mainstream papers in, say, London, here's a story in Zanzibar, use that. So the London paper would quote the Zanzibar paper saying that there is, whatever the information is, and then that story would then explode around the world without anybody really acknowledging that this was just a bullshit report from obscure Zanzibar. It would just be sort of accepted as whatever was said was fact because it had been reported by the British newspaper, re-reporting what the other paper had said. And this is a sort of a classic way that they would
Except this time we've got named sources, don't we?
This time it is the named sources is Zelensky and the head of the propaganda arm of the Ukrainian army. But nobody reads that bit.
But also the South Korean.
And yes, and then the South Korean, yes. But nobody reads that point and then goes, well, hang on, have they got an agenda? Have they got a bias? Would they be saying that for any particular reason? People don't get to that point. So, and because it's buried down the back of the last few paragraphs of where it came from, there's conjecture and reporting and musing over the whole idea for the first 400 words.
Yeah, that's what AI does.
Yeah, yes. And then the disclaimer tucked down the back. So later on, when it turns out that there wasn't North Koreans in Russia, and somebody says to the New York Times, you're a bunch of idiots, they'll say, oh, no, look there, paragraph 15, we said that there was no proof at the time. So this is the way it works. Yeah. Right.
As opposed to the Russians who set up a website, clone existing news articles using AI, and then insert their own news articles in there to make it look like this is a real news site.
Right. Yep.
Because apparently there's some Swedish websites being set up called election25.com in Sweden, something election.com in Swedish.
Yep.
And if you go back into where the funding comes from, it all looks a little murky.
Mm.
And it's almost certainly an FSB operation.
Yeah. You just got to find sources and writers that you can trust. And then if you haven't heard of them before or you're not sure about them, then you have to sort of double check what they say. So that's where we're at when it comes to media literacy, dear listener. I just want to put this one out because it was funny. This is from Caitlin Johnson.
Talking of dodgy sources.
Oh, you think Caitlin Johnson's a dodgy source?
I think she has a particular leaning, and everything is filtered through that. Yes.
I don't think she makes things up. I think she's clearly got her own opinions and worldview, which is very clearly stated. But she wouldn't make up.
It is very anti-American, though, what she actually does come out with.
Yeah. But that doesn't. What was the description you gave? It was. How did you describe her?
Oh,
just a minute ago.
I just think she has a particular ideological bent.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but most of what she says is opinion. But if she was to say X number of
probably.
Gazans are reported to have been killed yesterday by the Israelis or whatever, like she wouldn't be just making that stuff up. If she was referring to a fact, she would have very often a link to wherever she is reporting from. So I think...
Yeah, I mean, I think it was more on the, it doesn't really matter on the US election front who gets in because they're both the Palestinians.
Yes.
Which is just no.
Well, it depends on your priorities.
Well, exactly.
And she is highlighting Gaza as the world's priority, and highlighting that neither of them make a difference to that priority.
I would say only one has a particular area of the occupied territories named after them.
Yeah, but Kamala Harris is part of an administration that's been selling weapons to Israel and doesn't look like she's going to stop.
I think Trump will be considerably worse.
How could it be worse?
Well, because he wants some nice seafront property, doesn't he?
Well, if it keeps going the way it's going, he'll still get it. Like, he doesn't need to accelerate things for that to happen, does he? Like, how could it be worse?
American troops assisting?
They don't need them. This is a downtrodden group of people who are just starving in the streets, bloodied and emaciated.
I think if Iran gets involved, then the Yanks could actually get pulled into the whole thing completely, which would upset a lot of Arabs and that sort of stuff who are basically pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, and they just wouldn't know which side to be on. Would they be on the Iranian side against the Americans and the Israelis, or would they stay out of it? I think a lot of them would be demanding that their governments go to war with the Iranians against the Americans.
You lost me there. Can you just say that again?
No, okay. The Palestinians are very much loved throughout the Arab world.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got countries that have gone into normalization with Israel. They have normalized their relationships with Israel. Now, those countries are basically inhabited by Arabs. And if the only Arabs that were actually raising their arms against the Israelis were the Iranians, there would probably be a lot of pressure on those countries that had normalized relationships with Israel to throw out those normalized relationships to get on board the fight with Israel, which could actually drag the Yanks into a very long, bloody war.
I think a lot of that normalisation between Arab states and Israel sort of faltered and decreased after October 7th.
Oh, I think so.
So yeah. I think Saudi was moving towards normalising.
Saudi was more moving towards normalising.
But just the events of themselves have turned that around. So,
do you mean the events of Hamas, or do you mean the events of Israel?
The events of the genocide have turned that around. Yeah. So I think whatever positive relations were starting to happen between some Arab states and Israel, that all stopped and went downhill, a year ago now. So
yeah, probably.
But yeah, I mean, and there have been different attacks by Israel on Iran, and if the situation gets hotter by involving Iran, then we're all in trouble because that's not going to be good. There was just quoting now, back to quoting Caitlin Johnston. She says, thinking about something that was said by an Iranian cleric named Shahab Maradi after the US assassinated Iran's immensely popular general Qasem Soleimani in 2020. Maradi, the Iranian guy, complained that Iran can't even really retaliate for the assassination because the US doesn't have any real heroes of its own like Soleimani, saying, quote, think about it. Are we supposed to take out Spider-Man and SpongeBob? I thought that was a funny line. An Iranian said, what heroes are we going to kill? Spider-Man, SpongeBob?
Trump.
We can't get vengeance with these guys because they don't have heroes.
America worships Trump.
That was... you got to admit, the Iranian wit is improving with lines like that.
Oh, yeah, it is for sure.
Yeah. So, John in the chat room says she, I think referring to Caitlin Johnson, gets on Fox News all the time, Trev. A bit of a sad source. What do you mean she gets on Fox News all the time?
I presume she's brought on as a counterpoint.
I don't think
for everybody to laugh at her.
They would quote her, but I don't think she personally would appear on Fox News. I can't imagine. I'd love to see that if that's the case. So what do you mean a bit of a sad source? Because I'm interested, John. Can you expand on that comment, please? Right. Anyway, I thought that was funny. Indictment of American culture by the Iranian guy. Good line. US election. Any final thoughts before it happens, Scott?
Just that it's getting bloody close. But there was that bright bit of good news out of Ohio, was it? That they reckon Kamala has pulled ahead of Trump.
There was Seltzer, I think her name is.
Yeah, who's a very respected pollster because she actually predicted Trump would win in 2016 when everyone had Hillary winning. So that is just one of those things that I think that you don't have to take what she says with a grain of salt.
She's saying that older women, particularly white women, have been turned off by Trump's latest antics, finally.
Well, that doesn't surprise me. And also, I think a lot of the older women remember blood-covered...
Pre-Roe v. Wade, yes.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly. They remember the backyard abortions and that type of thing. They remember the women that died.
And, the ones who've died recently. But the other thing is, apparently there's been an uptick in people searching, can my husband see who I voted for?
Right. That's
really?
Interesting.
Yep. And there's a big push at the moment in the Democratic groups going, remember, you can choose to vote how you want and your husband can't see. I think
they've got that. A lot
of women are going to vote against Trump. They're just worried that their husbands are going to find out.
Which means that a lot of those white women in the outer suburbs and all that sort of stuff, their husband might be voting for Trump, but they reckon that their women, the wives, will end up voting for Harris.
The other commentary I've seen is, I wouldn't tell a pollster that I was voting for Harris because we know how he likes his retribution. And if my name is on a bit of paper saying that I'm going to vote for Harris, when the mob comes afterwards, my name is on a list.
Yeah.
So they're saying that the exact opposite of 2016, where the Trump voters were going, I couldn't possibly say I'm going to vote for Trump because I'll never live it down. Now they're saying, I can't say that I'm going to vote for Harris, not because I'll never live it down, but because the mob will come for me.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is very interesting. So one wonders how much these polls are out because people are literally scared for their lives.
It really wouldn't surprise me because, there has been a hell of a lot of shit that has been thrown. It really wouldn't surprise me that people are actually starting to fear for their lives.
Well, I reckon if Trump gets in, it's going to be because of disenchantment with the economy. Because people
I think you're right.
you see lots of comments where people are interviewed where they're basically saying, I was doing better under Trump than I'm doing now. And he was therefore a better economic manager. Without, of course,
there's also the scapegoating of all the illegal immigrants.
Yes.
And a lot of people who are blaming the illegal immigrants for all of their woes. And Trump is great at scapegoating them.
But feelings on an economy are such a strong driver of votes.
Yeah.
And I just think that potentially means that the parties are going to change every 4 years because the American economy is just heading for a cliff. And if people think things are bad now, hold on, because the fundamentals of that country are terrible, and it's not going to get any easier at all.
Well, there have been a couple of bills recently that have actually increased the number of jobs. The CHIPS bill, and there was another one, I can't remember what it was.
The IRA. The Inflation Reduction Act has actually resulted in more jobs.
Yeah. So there has been, unlike Trump, where he brought in his tariffs and caused trade wars with other countries, there has actually been some reduction in unemployment.
But, if you pick up a low-paying job when the cost of living is increasing, then you're still unhappy. So they're heading for financial ruin in that country, and it's just going to get uglier and uglier over time. So, of course, whether the economy is up or down in a particular presidency is all a matter of luck to a large extent, because it just depends on swings and roundabouts of different economies. It's like the Titanic, turning it around and making adjustments. You could make a whole bunch of great decisions in your first year that just wouldn't show up for years.
They're also saying that the US's recovery from COVID has been better than most of the rest of the world.
Right.
Yeah, double.
Health-wise?
No.
Right.
In terms of the economy, in terms of GDP.
Yep. But the thing about
3% as opposed to 1.5% for the most of them.
But, every increase in healthcare costs is an increase in GDP. Like, it's just they've got a crappy, a GDP sort of system as well. So, any way you want to slice it, I think they're in trouble over the next decade.
I mean, there's some serious concerns. Trump is already saying that there's been cheating going on. There's already been a number of attempts to. Apparently, there's a federal judge who's proved to be very MAGA. They've filed a whole bunch of cases in front of him, trying to allege, change rules, but basically start the whinges, the complaints.
Right.
So no matter which way this election, if Kamala wins, they will be claiming that it has been stolen. The difference is Trump's not the incumbent this time. So it's going to be a lot harder for him to get into the White House. The problem is if it's marginal and it goes up to the Supreme Court, we know which way the Supreme Court's going to rule. So like the 2000 election with George Bush and
Al Gore.
Al Gore it was, wasn't it? Where the Supreme Court basically gave it to Bush despite him having actually lost.
Yes, on the votes in Florida.
Yes.
Yep, because of their sort of punch card ticket system and all the arguments over all that.
Yeah. So there's a scary opportunity for Trump to get in, and if not, for violence to break out.
Yeah. Is it a democracy when you're faced with, well,
voting between the two lizards?
yes. I mean, we're in a state of the world at the moment where when the West wants to badmouth non-Western countries, it no longer can do it because they're communist, because after all, Russia, capitalist, China, a form of capitalism where they've retained control of finance and infrastructure, but market capitalism operating with, innumerable billionaires being created. So they can't say dirty, rotten communists anymore. They have to say authoritarian regime, whereas we are freedom democracies. That's what the difference is. That's what it's come down to these days.
You can still slag off the government without being hauled off in theoretical democracies.
Tell Julian Assange that.
Well,
Julian Assange has since been let go.
Oh, yeah. But don't tell me you can slag off the government.
He didn't just slag off the government, though. He did actually reveal secrets.
He did something the government didn't like.
Well, yeah.
And it wasn't even his government.
Oh, I know.
And what do we do in Australia when we've got a whistleblower who reports on stuff done by our military in Afghanistan? Do any of the soldiers or the brass get in trouble? No.
The journalist.
But the guy who exposed what was going on is where he is, in prison. And the lawyers like Bernard Collery end up having to fight for their lives in court as our Parliament seeks to have them put in jail or subject to charges. Like, when you say, oh, but at least we've got freedom of speech, and, there are journalists in the UK who are having their houses raided because of basically writing pro-Palestinian articles. And well-known journalists.
Hate speech laws.
Yeah, but essentially just saying it how it is and getting, the houses raided and in trouble that way. So when our governments want to intimidate, they can still do it.
Yeah, not to the same extent. I'm not going to say they're perfect.
Yeah.
They're less shit.
Yeah. Yeah. Less shit. Yeah.
I think I'd actually prefer to be in an Australian prison than I would be in a Russian gulag.
Yeah. I tell you, Belmarsh didn't sound like a easy stay.
No.
They put him in the toughest jail they had.
Yeah, I know.
It sounded pretty rough. Nearly killed him. And
he was in solitary, wasn't he?
Yeah. And I don't think Guantanamo was a particularly happy place either.
It
for
wasn't.
The people that they disagreed with there. So, yeah. Anyway. Democracy.
At least they don't shoot you and then send your family for an invoice for the bullet.
They don't? They just shoot you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, they just shoot people in other countries. So,
but again, don't send an invoice for the bullet.
Yeah. Yep.
You see John's comment?
What did he say? Pep, no? 60-40 Dems. What's that mean?
Up.
No? I have freedom of speech at home as long as Kay doesn't hear me. Yeah. Yeah. Where were we? How much time we got? 8:20. Scott, you got to go to bed early, I imagine. You've had a big weekend. Yep. Let me just say here. There is an article in the show notes for the patrons, which was written by a guy, Jerry Gray, who lives in China. And he was saying, in China, for example, where I live, people vote regularly for local representation. The West calls it autocracy. But I'm 100% certain, and this opinion is borne out by institutions such as Harvard University, San Diego University, and Edelman Trust Barometer and others, that given the choice in a general election, Chinese people would overwhelmingly vote for the CPC to represent them.
Well, who else are they going to vote for?
But they're quite happy with them. If there was an opposition of some sort,
maybe they'd be happy with the opposition.
But when people are asked, are you happy with your government? Mm-hmm. You get much higher levels of satisfaction in somewhere like China than you get in a democracy of America or perhaps even Australia.
Because they've never had a choice and therefore they don't know that they've got a choice.
Well, no, they're not living in a cave. They know what's going on in the West. They see our two-party democracies.
They see what a mess it is, yes.
And they say, fuck that. I don't want that. And again, anecdotally, I had my homestay boys here talking to them about stuff. They're viewing the Australian political scene. I go, do you wish you had two-party politics and a vote like this? And they go, no. It's a different way of dealing.
I don't want to have to make a decision. I want everything decided for me.
No, it's a different deal where the people are basically saying to the Communist Party, if everything's great and we're feeling good about the economy and our lifestyles, then keep doing what you're doing. That's the deal. Like, this is part of the cultural thing. Like I was talking earlier about Russia and what Putin had to deal with, and you've got just because we view a democracy with a two-party system as being the post-Enlightenment ideal that's led to the marvellous Western civilization, other cultures don't see it that way. And they would look at that system and go, no, we actually prefer our system. We're not idiots. We're fully informed. And we prefer to have experts in the government rather than dickheads like you all have as your ministers. You've got ministers for science who barely got past grade 12. They've got ministers for science with PhDs. Like, they would look... This is the hubris, is it? Is that the word? Conceit, arrogance of the West hubris. To go, we have the system, and if only they knew how good our system was, they would want it. But they know, and they don't. And theirs is working better. And when they're polled, there's no doubt that they're happy with their system.
I've got no doubt that the average Chinese person is quite happy with their system.
Yep.
I've got no doubt about it.
Yep.
However, just across the Taiwan Strait, you have got another China, the Republic of China, that has evolved into a liberal democracy. And they do not want to go backwards. They do not want the PRC to take them over.
Mm.
Now, are you saying that group of Chinese, exactly the same culturally as the mainland Chinese, are dickheads?
No. I'm saying we here wouldn't want a Communist Party arrangement.
No,
because we're used to, culturally, the system we've got, and it would be a massive change to us that we couldn't handle. So it's horses for courses. It's just a recognition that some people have a culture that lends them to one direction, which isn't bad just because it's different to the West. It suits them and it works.
Why would the Taiwanese, who are exactly the same culturally as the mainland Chinese, why would they accept and embrace a liberal capitalist democracy, but those that are left on the mainland wouldn't?
Why did it happen?
No, why would they embrace it and be quite proud of their democracy? but those that are in the mainland wouldn't want the same sort of democratic rights and principles that they have in Taiwan.
Because of the history of what's happened in Taiwan over the last 50 years,
Yeah,
we've
I
got people
suppose.
who've
Well,
grown up with that system.
Yeah, they've grown up with it.
You know, so
They
that's
didn't
the point.
they didn't have a democracy at first. It was a military
but
dictatorship.
it was imposed on them. So it was,
Yeah.
you know, they weren't asked. So,
But yeah, it's just
but having been imposed, their culture has now been changed so that they are now viewing that as option A for them because of what's happened over the last couple of generations. So that makes sense. But it's just this glorification of the Western democracy, which I'm not saying we should adopt a Chinese Communist Party philosophy here because we culturally are different. But we have to accept that for those people, it works for them and they're happy with it, and it shouldn't be demonised just because it's different. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Well, I don't think I'd demonise them. Aside from Tiananmen Square, which is the biggest cock-up that they ever made, then I don't think the Chinese government actually wants to invade anyone else or anything else. I think that they are actually probably stretching the friendship over the South China Sea, but they are just basically taking back what is theirs. And they've just got to actually come to some sort of arrangement with Taiwan so that then they can negotiate a settlement and then they can accept that they won the civil war and that they're going to leave Taiwan to be its own people, its own self.
Yeah. All right. Just want to make that point about democracy when we've got a big American election coming up. So,
I don't think you right now you can actually hold up the United States as a shining example of democracy.
And when people start banging on about democracy as opposed to these authoritarian states like China, people just have to push back a bit and say, hang on a minute, culturally it works for them, economically it works for them, overwhelmingly the people are happy. It may not work for us because we're culturally different, but for them it's working. So stop demonising it. So, yeah. Anyway, what was I going to say? Joe, you found something about donations.
I did. I was looking at the Queensland the ECQ, the Electoral Commission of Queensland.
Just in your spare time, you're wandering around.
Well, I was looking, I was seeing whether they've published whether they finished counting from last week's election.
Right.
And one of the links on the page was a donors register, and trawling around looking at who donated where, I came across Coal Australia and thought, oh, that looks interesting. I wonder who they've donated to. And there are 8 donations over the last 2 months. Australian Institute for Progress, who Don had asked me about, because there was a leaflet drop going on about how we couldn't afford another 4 years of Labor.
Right.
And that surprised me because the Australian Institute in Canberra is a very left-leaning think tank.
Indeed. And
so I was going, who the hell are these Australian Institute for Progress? Well, I don't know who they are, but they've received about $500,000, somewhere between $500,000 and $600,000 from Australian Coal, or Coal Australia, I should say.
Yeah.
There's also Australians for Prosperity, $500,000. Jobs for mining communities, you'd expect that. That was another 300,000. So all in all, Coal Australia has donated somewhere around $1 million.
Yeah.
$1 million in the last 2 months to various campaigns that are anti-Labor, I would have said.
Yeah. It's only since the 16th of September to the 18th of October, basically 1 month. And the groups are Australian Institute for Progress, Australians for Prosperity, Jobs for mining communities, PDY Ltd.
That's it.
And the donations are 390,000, 495,000, 77,000, 121,000, 130,000, 25,000, 230,000, 173,000. So, it's let me guess. It'd be no surprise if all of those organisations were very much pro coal mining. Yeah.
And obviously, Labour have pissed off the coal miners.
Yeah. And these guys aren't political parties, but
Correct.
they seem to be associated closely enough that they have to be.
They are political lobby groups.
Yeah.
And so political lobby groups need to be registered.
Yeah.
It's worth having a look on the ECQ website. And if you're not in Queensland, have a look in your local state, particularly in the lead up to an election, and just see where the funds are going, who the large donations are coming from. Because certainly the Queensland one, you can sort by size of donation. You can also search by donor, and you can search by recipient. There was one where I looked, and I can't remember who it was. I think it was going to Qatar. And there were 20 donations, at least 20 donations, one a day, of $8,333. So I'm curious as to whether there's a cap of some sort on political donations, that if it's above a certain amount, you have to declare it in a different way, or quite what it is. But there's something weird anyway.
Might be into numerology, the donor. Might be some significance to that number.
Maybe there's some weird thought process they have. But I wondered if there was a political reason or a legal reason why these amounts.
Right. Well,
I couldn't tell you.
Yeah. We've got to get going. What are we on? Tuesday. So no, tomorrow's Tuesday. Wednesday will be when the results start to come in the mornings from the election. And I think Planet Extra has got something happening on the ABC radio Wednesday night or something like that. So
I still think One American News is going to be the channel to watch.
One America.
Yep.
Can anyone watch that?
Yeah, I believe it's streaming on the internet.
Okay. All right, because that's a extreme, more right wing than Fox News.
That's more right wing than Fox News. Yeah, apparently Fox News pissed the maggers off last time round because they were saying that Trump had lost, whereas OAN wouldn't concede that Trump had lost. So I think it would be fun to watch, if only for a few hours.
John, I think it's a circular argument. If you're relatively happy with your life, why would you say you're unhappy with whatever government you have? Well, when people are asked, are you happy with the government? People say, yes, I am happy with our system of government. So that doesn't seem circular to me. And there can be people in authoritarian regimes where there is no opposition who say, I'm not happy with the government, even though there's no opposition. So it doesn't look circular to me when somebody is asked, what do you think of the way that the Communist Party is running the country? And they go, I'm very happy with it. Thank you very much.
I'm very happy with it. Please don't take me out and shoot me.
Yeah. No, Joe, these are not under threat. Unlike an American election where apparently people do feel threatened.
Well, yes.
And have to Google whether their husband's going to find out what they voted.
Yes.
Yeah. So, right. Right. Okay. Daniel is new in the chat. We had a Daniel in the chat room before. Good on you, Daniel. Looks like you're new to the chat room. Good to see you joining in. So he says, because the Taiwanese feel abandoned by the Chinese in the past, and so they embrace capitalism. Well, I don't think they had much choice about it, Daniel. I think they're pretty much told capitalism the way to go. Scott's gone, has he?
Scott's still in the waiting room. What's he
doing over there? Hang on. Are you leaving us, Scott?
I know. I couldn't tell you. I just lost connection. So okay. God knows why. Anyway.
Right. Yeah.
And okay. Daniel is new. Hi, Daniel.
Good on you.
Hello, Daniel.
Yeah. All right. For those in the chat room, thank you. Even when you disagree, which is like John, and I'm looking forward to that free beer at some stage. I'll be scouring the internet for proof there are no Russians. All right. And Essential Lord Don says, I will watch the only service worth watching, Sky News, for a laugh. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think
All
I'm
right.
watching the ABC.
Yeah. All right. If something extraordinary happens, we could do an emergency podcast. So subscribe to us on Facebook.
What would you
So
call
you
what would you call a emergency? Well,
doing it on a Wednesday
violence
night
or something like that.
Yeah, if something extraordinary happened, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's anything could happen.
Yeah, the insurrection won't be till January.
Yeah. So
No.
anyway, subscribe on Facebook. That way you get notified if we decide to do
Facebook,
anything.
Twitch, or YouTube.
Yes. And I tried Rumble tonight. I'm not sure if that's worked, but I'll go in and check. So I think it might have worked at Rumble. So see how we go. All right, we've got to go. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll be back next week, if not before. Bye for now.
And it's a good night from me.